All right, welcome back to U.S. History. Mr. Rosenleaf coming at you, and we are talking about the 1920s today. We're going to do this for a few days. But, the 1920s, so the period after World War I, although we'll go a little bit back into the prior times, because some of that stuff just works out better talking about it now than then. But the 1920s is largely known as being a heyday of, partying. I mean, if you've ever read The Great Gatsby, it seems like that everybody in the 1920s was having these elaborate parties or trying to get across a lake to get to a green light or something like that. But in reality, the 1920s was a highly complex decade, full of very, very high points and also quite low points. This was really the beginning of the era that's going to lead us to the Great Depression. And so we can't forget that was coming, even though popular culture maybe made it seem like the 20s were just this party decade. Really, that was not the case, especially if you were not fabulously well off. If you were fabulously well off, then yeah, it was a party decade. We'll just go with that. I wrote some stuff on the slide. Prosperity, good times. Come on, buddy, have another drink. Buy some stock on margin. It's okay. Everybody's doing it. History is bunk. The jazz age will last forever. Where am I? Why am I in this handbasket? Hello? Do you know who I am? I want to speak to the manager of this handbasket. Anyway. And also just a thought here that taking notes is probably a good idea. It would help you in the long run. I'm not going to grade your notes. I'm not going to go through them. I'm not going to, get after you because you didn't write down this or that. But really, rather than just sitting there, have a notebook out. Jot some stuff down. Just a thought. And you certainly should not be doing other work while this is happening. Really, anytime. If we're doing in class work together, you should not be doing other work. Okay, so I'll get off my soapbox for that. All right. So, this style here, and we're starting out talking about ladies' fashions. So this was the very traditional woman. This had been the style really from the early part of the 20th century, even the late part of the 19th century. This was very what they call Victorian style, named after Queen Victoria of Great Britain. And it was very proper, very straight-laced. I mean, you can see, just take a look at these frankly magnificent dresses. And what you might notice about them are the fact that they were made from a lot of material. It's estimated, I think these things, the average one was like 20 yards of fabric to make these dresses. What else might you notice about this? If you notice that there is hardly any skin showing, that is very true as well. These dresses would have gone all the way to the wrists, from the neck down. Notice the one gal has a little bit of a neckline showing, but she's still very, very covered up. So from the neck down to the ankles, all the way to the wrists, everything covered, aside from maybe the hands, and oftentimes the hands would be covered by gloves. This was very much part of the style in the early part of the 20th century. Not a lot of makeup going on, although it's hard to tell with it being a charcoal drawing. But no makeup. Ladies like these would not have been caught dating. What they would have done was called courting, where the gentleman would actually go to the lady's home and spend time with the lady in the company of her parents or with a chaperone. And there certainly would not have been any premature touching, kissing, maybe a polite peck on the cheek or something, but certainly nothing like what some folks do today. These ladies would not have been caught publicly drinking or smoking. They may have had drinks in the privacy of their homes, maybe wine or something like that, but certainly not any hard alcohol of any kind. These girls that had this fashion, these were called Gibson girls. I am not sure where the Gibson part comes from. I think I looked it up once upon a time, and the story was boring enough that I didn't commit it to memory, which is saying something for me. But anyway, that was what they were called, were Gibson girls. These were the traditional girls, and this style stretches into the 1920s as well, but it's going to have a conflict, a conflicting style that is almost the polar opposite of what this is. And that is, of course, this. So what do you notice about this young lady? What's different here than what you maybe saw in the Gibson girls? Let's start with just the dress. You're noticing here that you're actually seeing curves, and you're seeing a neckline, and you are certainly seeing a great deal in the we'll call it the chestal region there that you certainly would not have seen from the traditional girls that we just saw the drawing of. You see this woman's arms, and that was certainly something that you would not have seen there. She is wearing gloves, but her arms are entirely exposed. Her neck is exposed, aside from the very sort of skimpy feather boa. And if you look down, you can see her legs. You can see her ankles. Now they are covered by stockings, but traditional girl of the 20s would have been aghast at something like this. The shoes, you couldn't really see the shoes in the previous drawing, but those women were very sort of conservative, chunky heel kind of shoes. These are very different. These are more akin to what you would see today, almost. Very high heel for that time, pointy. Looked like they would absolutely destroy your feet and ankles within 15, 20 years. But yeah, so these girls, oh, and look at the hair too. I didn't even talk about the hair on the last picture, but their hair was worn very up, but if they had taken it down, it was very, very long. Women didn't cut their hair a lot during that time period, whereas this woman, her hair is very, very short and concealed within what they called a cloche hat. So a very form-fitting hat. The hats that the traditional girls had were very sort of wide brim affairs or sort of fancy affairs, whereas this was fairly simple, although I'm sure cost an arm and a leg. These dresses, incidentally, the fabric was, they said it was down to about 7 yards of fabric for every dress, from the about 20 yards for the Gibson girl dresses. And I think 7 on this dress is maybe even a little generous. I would guess it's probably less than that. Yeah, so very, very different, these two. These girls, the girls that dressed like this were known as flappers. So named because one of the popular dances was called the Charleston. And if I had both legs, I would certainly demonstrate the Charleston for you. I am known to do a halfway decent Charleston. But basically it involves sort of kicking up your feet to the sides in a rhythmic fashion. And when you did that, your shoes would often sort of come off the back of your heels and then hit them and create a flapping sensation or a flapping sound. And that was why these ladies were called flappers. So the hair is known as a bob haircut. And the bob is still in some ways in fashion today, various alternations of it. So much more modern. A flapper woman would have been far more likely to be a smoker and smoke in public. These women hung out in illegal bars called speakeasies frequently, and there would be public smoking. And these women also would not have shied away from hard liquor, gin being one of the easier to acquire, but pretty much anything that you could get your hands on, because we were in the period of prohibition, which we'll talk about another day. But so these women would have been far more likely to be out in the public. These women would have been far more likely to maybe not live with their parents, even if they were unmarried. Oftentimes, these ladies had jobs in cities and would live in apartments, either alone or with roommates. And eventually, marriage would come to a lot of these women, and then they would obviously live with their husbands. But for a time, these women were about as liberated as the 1920s would allow a woman to be. And to a lot of people, that was very, very threatening. There were a lot of people that thought these women were basically possessed by the devil. But about 30% of women considered themselves to be flappers, and a number of other ones, even if they didn't consider themselves to be flappers, still adopted at least some form of the style. Maybe not as short a dress, maybe not as bare at arms or something like that, but some form of that style is going to become more and more and more popular as the 20s go on. So here's just this is an actual photograph. So you can see again the bare arms, the chestal region, the bare legs. And here are women again. And this is again some variant of the style. They don't all have bare arms, but they are showing off their legs. They have certainly a little more risque footwear than a traditional girl would have had. So again, this style starts to become very much embedded in the culture, even though only about 30% of the women would have identified themselves as true flappers. Oh, this is a song about bobbing your hair. I probably can't play it, or I'm going to get content blocked. I will try, and if I can find it, I will put a link to it in the Google Classroom thing and on Moodle for the online students. Okay, so women smoking and drinking, production of cigarettes is going to double during this period. More single women were in the workforce. They had less time, needed convenience-type products. We'll talk a little bit more about that coming up. And a lot of professions were either closed to women or struck women in entry-level positions in that. Business, for example, would stick women as typists, secretaries, etc., and would not let them graduate into being executives. That's not going to happen until probably the 70s. And here's a cigarette ad from this time where they are advertising that 20,000 some physicians recommend Lucky Strikes, which nowadays, if you know anything about cigarettes, Lucky Strikes are the ones that don't have any filter on them. And that I can't even imagine a doctor recommending a cigarette, let alone Lucky Strikes. But Yeah, this was where we're at now, 1920s. Okay, so women are feeling more empowered because at the end of World War One, after their cooperation in World War One, and we saw that during the World War One unit, women were involved in domestic industries. Women were involved; they were actually in the military, including the famous Hello Girls in France. Who were telephone operators, but also combat nurses and administrative support. All of those folks were involved in the military, either as civilians or as actual enlisted military officers, or not officers, but enlisted military personnel. And so at the end of that, even though promises that were made to other minority groups, such as African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Native Americans, etc., were not kept, women did have their promise kept, and the President and Congress will support the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, granting women the right to vote nationwide. Now, several states had already granted women the right to vote. In fact, one state had already sent a woman to Congress, that being Montana and Jeanette Rankin. You will see female governors in places like Texas and Wyoming. Both of those happen to be the wives of former governors, but still female governors. And across the country, there were 145 women in 35 state legislatures after the passage of the 19th Amendment, and that number will go up after going down for a bit, but it will eventually come up. So a lot of women, though, even though they had the right to vote, many of them didn't. Only 35% of women that were eligible voted in 1920 after the passage of the 19th Amendment. Many just weren't interested. They had never paid attention to politics. They were not going to start paying attention to politics. Some women did not feel that it was their right to vote. They didn't feel that women should have the right to vote. They felt that voting was really a man's thing, and they didn't want any part of it. Okay, so a couple of quick things here, and so two quick ones and then one that, well, I guess these are both kind of slow. Why do you think did women seek more freedom in the 1920s? And why did some women not want that freedom? So go ahead, pause the video for a moment and discuss both of those very briefly. Great job. I'm sure there was some fantastic discussion going on in both classes because you're both equally loquacious. All right. So in the world of agriculture, you have, after the war, so during the war, the government had been buying basically all of the excess agricultural production that America could spare. And so prices were pretty high during the war. And so farmers were doing pretty good. And so farmers took that opportunity, times were good, they're going to go ahead and take out loans and try and expand their production. They're going to buy more land, they're going to invest in new equipment, etc. And after the war, the opposite thing's going to happen. The prices are going to start falling because the government is no longer the number one consumer of the agricultural products, and as such, the costs for the farmers are going to go up as well. And as the prices fall, the farmers are not going to be able to as easily pay those loans that they took out during the war years when times were good. And we've talked about this before, and we will talk about this again. This is like the cycle of American agriculture. And I don't know that there's anything we can do to fix it, because when times are good, yeah, people spend more. And then when times are bad, they try and spend less. And they get burned. I mean, that's just the reality of having credit. But anyway, so agriculture started having the Great Depression really about the mid-1920s. Agriculture was struggling early to mid-1920s. But more and more Americans are going to be moving from rural areas to urban areas in search of better jobs. Some 6 million are going to head that way. You're also going to start to see more and more attendance at public schools, especially public high schools. More and more states are actually going to have them, and more young people are actually going to attend. It's still not as much as the attendance in elementary schools, but more and more young people are graduating from high school. These are typical school-aged young people of the 1920s with their teacher, but the rest of them are boys. So this must have been a boys' school with a female teacher. You also are going to start to see, in terms of demographics, you're going to start to see African Americans even before the war. In fact, the war was kind of the impetus for this. They are going to start moving from rural areas in the South to urban areas in the North. Farm labor was not lucrative at all, has never been lucrative, will never be lucrative. And so African Americans who largely did not own their own land, who largely were working for other people, start to say, gee, if I'm going to work for other people, I'd like to get paid better to do it. So they're going to head for factories in places like Chicago, in places like Detroit, Michigan, places like Indianapolis, Indiana, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Ohio, cities in Ohio, Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, New York City, Boston, Massachusetts, places in New Jersey. I don't memorize places in New Jersey. Maryland, Delaware. Those are all going to be places where people come to because there is industry. Oh, in California, African Americans are going to make the big trip out to California to make a living out there because there is industry happening out there as well. So all of those states in blue that you see on the map, those were places that had the highest increase in African American population during this time, and the red states had the highest decrease in African American population. Now, eventually that will kind of turn around a bit, and you will see increase in population in the southern states. That will be after the advent of a little thing called air conditioning. But at this point, the South was hot and muggy, and you didn't really want to live there. You also had in the South, you had things like the KKK going on. Like I said, wages were low, lots of hate crimes, and African Americans really saw the North as sort of a promised land. That ends up being only kind of the case. There are still the racial issues in the North. They're just not advertised as freely as they were in the South. You also have suburbs coming up as African Americans are entering the major cities. White folks that are living in those cities are going, uh-oh, I don't want to live next to black people. And they are going to start bugging out and building their own communities outside of town. And then the men in those communities will commute into work. Oftentimes, there will be commuter trains that they can take from these little communities into town, or they will pile in their cars. And during the 19-teens and 1920s is when we start to see more and more Americans owning cars, thanks to the pioneering work of people like Henry Ford and the Dodge brothers. But these suburbs were really not open to racial minorities. Plain and simple. If you were a racial minority and tried to build a house there, you would not be welcomed. Okay, so real quick, a couple quick ones and then one to think about. Who is moving? So you should have answered African Americans to cities, and who else is moving? That's right, white Americans to the suburbs. It's also known as white flight. And finally, the one to think about, why do you think this trend was so important? So think about the ramifications of this. Pause the video for a second and try and think about it. Okay, that's great. So some of the ramifications of this include the very slow sort of almost hollowing out of the cities. And cities will become known for being these lands of lots of crime and lots of drugs and issues like that. That then, as we get towards the 20th century, white folks will rediscover the cities and start moving back in, but they're going to start fixing things up, for lack of a better term, and driving out the minority residents who had lived there for years, because they're also going to drive up the rent. So you get that gentrification effect happening in those cities. But it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. All right. So the last thing I just want to briefly touch on before we end is this idea of mass media. This idea of people having basically kind of a shared experience, getting information, news, entertainment in a mass form. Lots of people being informed, entertained, etc. at the same time. This is going to be very different than what we had previously. Sure, we had newspapers, we had magazines, but newspapers only extended really to the geographic areas that they served for the most part, and magazines only reached so far, and they were weekly, and not everybody read magazines. But mass media is going to become something that really the entire country cannot ignore. And one of the first places where we see this is in motion pictures. So motion pictures did exist prior to this time, but they were largely sort of small-scale affairs. They were made in places like New York City, because that's where the entertainers were, and they were made on Broadway stages that they would rent out during the day to make movies, and at night the theaters would be full for vaudeville and stuff like that. But these movies didn't spread as far as you would think. There was no mass production of movies. There was no mass distribution of movies. That's going to start changing with this guy. His name is Cecil B. DeMille. And DeMille is going to be the first guy to think, hey, wouldn't it be nice if I could film outside? Wouldn't it be nice if I could film somewhere where the weather would cooperate with me to film outside? Wouldn't it be nice if I could film somewhere where I could store props and sets and have permanent sets that we didn't have to tear down at 5 o'clock to get ready for an 8 o'clock showing of a vaudeville show? Wouldn't that stuff be nice? And so DeMille starts looking around, and he lands out in California, and he lands in Southern California, and he buys a plot of land. Everything around him is like fruit orchards. So he's in the middle of these orchards, and it's absolute filming nirvana. He has great weather all year. He can film in the sun. He can build sound stages to film stuff that's not in the sunlight. He can have permanent sets. He has places that he can store sets, props, and entertainers start to follow him out there. And DeMille is one of the first guys to really kick off the American motion picture industry. The start is with silent pictures, but that will soon change. But DeMille's studio will be right in the middle of what will become Hollywood, California. And more moguls are going to start moving out there, putting up studios. More and more entertainers are going to start moving out there because that was now where the work was in motion pictures, and that was where you could get famous. You're even going to start to see the beginning of sort of paparazzi, reporters that follow these stars, not to the extent that they are followed today, but certainly they write about what these stars are doing and what the stars at this point want them to write about, for the most part. But all of that starts here in the early part of the 20th century. And this is going to help develop American national culture. Because prior to this, we didn't really have any sort of scenario where a lot of people could have the same experience at the same time. We talked about, when we talked about like Edison, his phonograph that could replay sound, and that was kind of the beginning of recorded music. Prior to that, you didn't have recorded music. You didn't know what the original artist intended when they wrote a song. You would have to buy sheet music and play it for yourself, and everybody plays a little differently. And I mean, any accompanist, any pianist will tell you that there's a lot of variation that happens just in your style, your personal style. So you never really heard what the artist intended until we got the phonograph and the gramophone that could replay recorded music. And now, instead of having to go watch a play, you could watch something on the silver screen that was the same thing so you're watching it in Great Falls the same time somebody's watching it in New York City, the same time somebody's watching it in Atlanta, Georgia, etc. And everybody's having a shared experience, not necessarily together, but everybody's watching the same thing at the same time. And we just didn't have that prior to the 1920s. So movies and other forms of mass media are going to give that common culture, that shared experience that America just didn't have. We were too big. We were just plain and simple too big for that. And I found a couple of old movie posters. One of them advertises itself as a talkie, so ignore that one. But yeah. So here we go. So for the in-class students, your reflection document, please start a new reflection document. For the online students, please answer this in the journal assignment below this video. For those of you doing the reflection document, please type your first and last name, your period number, and your favorite pizza topping in the top right-hand corner of the first page. So here are your 3 reflection questions. Number 1, what do you think was behind the flapper and liberation movements for women of the early 20th century? Number 2, how was society changing by the 1920s? Provide at least 2 solid examples. And number 3, what is the relationship between mass media and American national culture? So there you go. Please respond to those again in your reflection document or for the online students in the journal assignment below this video. And in-person students, please hang on to that reflection document, save it in your Google Drive, and we will come back to it the next time we have a video. With that, certainly if you have questions, please ask me tomorrow, or you can ask Ms. Crawford, and she may be able to answer a few things for you. But until then, onward and upward, and see you tomorrow. Thanks, guys. Bye.